The B-24 Liberator was the most produced bomber of World War II, dropping more bombs, flying more missions, and striking more targets than any of its rivals. Yet, for the men who climbed into its cramped fuselage, the Liberator wasn't a savior, it was a curse. Crews called it the Flying Coffin, condemned its unstable design, and lived with the knowledge that a single flak burst or training accident could turn their aircraft into a blazing tomb. It destroyed more of the enemy than any other Allied bomber, but it also claimed the lives of thousands of its own airmen. This is the disturbing truth of the B-24, the bomber that closed the Atlantic Gap, hammered Nazi industry, and crushed enemy supply lines. But at a price so high, its story has been overshadowed. Stay with us, because the deeper we go, the more terrifying this machine's legacy becomes. And before we dive in, make sure you subscribe for more World War II stories, because the darkest details are the ones history tried to bury. At the dawn of 1939, the United States Army Air Corps believed it had found its ultimate weapon in the B-17 Flying Fortress. This four-engined giant represented the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing, a strategy built on the idea that from 20,000 feet, bombers could cripple enemy industries with devastating accuracy. With war looming on the horizon, the Air Corps wanted more fortresses, so many that they asked Consolidated Aircraft to build B-17s under license. But Consolidated took one look at Boeing's design and made a bold declaration: we can do better. Instead of producing an aircraft that already existed, they proposed a new machine that would be faster, fly higher, carry more bombs, and go further than the B-17. The Air Corps couldn't refuse, and within months, the project that would become the B-24 Liberator was born. The first prototype took to the skies in December 1939. Its appearance was shocking: a high-mounted shoulder wing, a deep boxy fuselage, and twin tails that made it instantly recognizable. It looked ungainly compared to the sleek B-17, but every detail was engineered for a single purpose: efficiency. Inside Consolidated's design bureau, engineer David Davis had pioneered a radical wing design. Known as the Davis wing, it used an unusually long, narrow shape that generated less drag, more lift, and could carry enormous loads of fuel. Combined with the Liberator's spacious fuselage, this meant the B-24 could fly further than any bomber in America's arsenal, while still hauling up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, nearly a third more than the Flying Fortress. The Air Corps had asked for more B-17. What they got instead was a bomber that promised to redefine America's role in the skies of World War II. But, as history would show, those promises came with consequences no one foresaw. The Liberator's unusual design owed much to Consolidated's history with flying boats. Engineers who had spent years building massive seaplanes adapted their ideas to a land-based bomber. The result was a deep, buoyant fuselage that offered massive internal space for bomb bays and fuel tanks, paired with wings positioned high above the body to keep engines clear of spray. That flying boat DNA gave the B-24 its boxy look and cavernous bomb bay, which could swallow 8,000 pounds of bombs, far more than its contemporaries. Its bomb bay doors rolled up inside the fuselage rather than swinging open, reducing drag and allowing the bomber to maintain speed even during drops. The Davis wing, thick at the root but elegantly tapered, carried fuel and supported 4 powerful engines, giving the Liberator range unmatched by other Allied bombers. These innovations made it the most versatile heavy bomber in the Allied arsenal, adaptable to roles from long-range bombing to anti-submarine patrols. But brilliance came with flaws. The very design that gave the B-24 its endurance also made it treacherous in emergencies. Attempts to land on water ended in tragedy more often than not. The aircraft's high-set wings and deep fuselage caused it to break apart and sink rapidly. Survival rates after ditching were abysmally low. Crews whispered that a B-24 in the ocean became a coffin in seconds. Despite these dangers, demand for the aircraft surged. Its combination of long range and heavy payload offered something no other Allied bomber could. Britain, already at war with Germany, placed orders before the prototype had even completed testing. France did the same, though its surrender meant those aircraft went to the RAF. By March 1941, British crews were flying the first Liberators on operational missions, long before America entered World War II. The B-24 had been born from innovation, but its reputation would be forged in blood. Its revolutionary features promised victory, but they also made the Liberator a plane crews would both depend on and fear. The first Liberators to fly in combat didn't bear American stars, but British roundels. Even before America entered World War II, Britain had recognized the bomber's potential and placed urgent orders. When the first B-24s rolled out of Consolidated's factories, they went not to U.S. airmen, but to the Royal Air Force. By March 1941, RAF crews were operating the very first production models. At first, these aircraft weren't even used as bombers. Britain, desperate to link its empire and the United States, used early Liberators as long-range transports. The deep fuselage, originally designed to carry bombs, made them perfect for ferrying personnel across the Atlantic. But it didn't take long for the RAF to realize that the B-24's true gift wasn't its cargo space, it was its range. Nowhere was that range more critical than over the mid-Atlantic. For years, German U-boats had hunted convoys in the Atlantic Gap, a vast expanse of ocean out of reach from both British and American land-based aircraft. Merchant ships loaded with food, weapons, and fuel were left helpless in those waters, and the Kriegsmarine's wolf packs slaughtered them by the dozens. Britain teetered on the edge of starvation. The arrival of the Liberator changed everything. Fitted with radar, depth charges, and extra fuel tanks, the Very Long Range (VLR) Liberators of RAF Coastal Command were the first planes capable of escorting convoys all the way across the Atlantic. Flying low over the waves, they prowled for U-boats, striking with terrifying precision. Crews learned to attack from altitudes as low as 50 feet, dropping depth charges set to detonate just below the surface. At first, there were only a handful of these modified Liberators. As one British officer recalled bitterly, "We started with about 4. The Americans were stingy. They wouldn't give us more. Eventually, we got up to 10. Yet even that small number tipped the balance. Convoys once defenseless now had guardian angels overhead. German submariners began to realize that surfacing was no longer safe. By 1943, the steady flow of Liberators into service helped close the Atlantic Gap completely. The wolf packs that had once strangled Britain's supply lines were driven back, their happy time over. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the very lifeline of Allied survival, the B-24 Liberator played a decisive role before America had even committed its full might to the war. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the Liberator was ready to take on its intended role, a heavy bomber built not for patrols or transport, but for mass destruction. By late 1942, the first American B-24 groups began arriving in Britain, forming part of the 8th Air Force. They were joined by units flying out of North Africa and later Italy, forming the 15th Air Force. Together, they became a central pillar of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The B-24 promised what the Air Corps had demanded: long range, high payload, and greater speed than the beloved B-17. From North Africa, Liberators pounded Axis supply routes across the Mediterranean, while from England they struck deep into German-held Europe. Targets included oil refineries, industrial plants, shipyards, and railway lines. The bomber's versatility meant it could serve in every theater: Europe, the Pacific, even the China-Burma-India front. But the statistics revealed the horrifying reality of what it meant to fly one. By mid-1944, nearly half of America's bomber strength in Europe was made up of B-24s. That dominance came at a terrible cost. Missions were long, conditions inside the aircraft were brutal, and casualty rates soared. The average life expectancy of a bomber crewman was measured in missions, not years. Flak shells tore through formations. German fighters hunted bombers with ruthless efficiency, and mechanical issues were common. Inside, crews faced a nightmare of cramped, freezing conditions. The bomb bay was wide but treacherous, with only narrow catwalks separating men from a 20,000-foot drop. The roar of the engines never ceased, while oxygen masks often froze at high altitudes. And unlike the myth of the invincible bomber, the B-24 was not indestructible. Its lighter frame made it faster, yes, but also more fragile. The Liberator was a paradox. It could haul more bombs further than any Allied heavy bomber, but its crews often felt less protected than those in the B-17. Nicknames began to emerge among airmen: the Flying Coffin and the Problem Plane. Yet despite the dread it inspired among its own crews, the B-24 kept flying, mission after mission, because sheer numbers made it irreplaceable. By 1943 and 1944, thousands of Liberators were in service worldwide. It was the workhorse of the Allied air campaign, and for the men strapped inside, the most dangerous job in the world. On August 1, 1943, the B-24 Liberator was chosen for what was supposed to be one of the war's most decisive strikes, Operation Tidal Wave. The target was Ploiești, Romania, home to Nazi Germany's most vital oil refineries. Hitler's armies ran on Romanian oil, and American planners believed that by crippling Ploiești, they could strangle the German war machine in a single, devastating blow. It was an audacious plan. A force of 177 B-24s would take off from bases in North Africa, fly 1,200 miles across hostile territory, and strike the refineries at low altitude to maximize destruction. The crews were briefed. This was the mission that could shorten the war. Morale was high, but few of the men realized just how suicidal the assignment would be. Flying barely above treetop level, the formations struggled to hold course. Navigation errors scattered the groups. As the bombers approached Ploiești, German defenses, already tipped off by intelligence leaks, were waiting. Flak guns lined the approaches, spitting fire into the skies. Smoke and flames from burning refineries created a hellscape, blinding pilots and disorienting crews. What followed was carnage. Liberators were shredded in mid-air, exploding into fireballs before their bombs could even be released. Others smashed into the ground after clipping smokestacks. German fighters pounced on the confused formations, adding to the slaughter. One eyewitness later said the sky over Ploiești looked like a tornado of burning aluminum. By the time the survivors limped back to base, the losses were staggering. Out of 177 Liberators, 53 were destroyed, nearly a third of the entire strike force. Around 660 airmen were killed, captured, or interned. Entire crews vanished in the flames, their names remembered only in casualty reports. And the most bitter truth of all? The refineries were back in operation within weeks. Oil production barely dipped. Operation Tidal Wave became a symbol of both the Liberator's devastating power and its horrific vulnerability. It showed the world that strategic bombing could bleed Germany, but also bleed America dry in the process. For B-24 crews, the lesson was clear. In the Liberator, victory and death often flew side by side. The dangerous truth of the B-24. The B-24 was a machine of contradiction. On paper, it was superior to the B-17 Flying Fortress, faster, longer range, and able to carry a heavier bomb load. But ask the men who flew it, and many would tell you they hated the Liberator. To them, it wasn't a fortress. It was a coffin with wings. The complaints were relentless. The controls were heavy and unresponsive, wearing pilots down on long missions. The aircraft's high-mounted Davis wing gave it efficiency, but also instability, making it more difficult to handle in turbulence or under fire. And unlike the famously rugged B-17, the B-24 was fragile. Photographs circulated of fortresses returning home riddled with holes, wings shredded, tails half gone. By contrast, Liberators were often seen exploding in mid-air, unable to absorb the same punishment. Training accidents highlighted these weaknesses. In 1943, the B-24 earned the grim nickname the Problem Plane because of how frequently it was involved in deadly crashes. Part of the blame lay with rushed training and inexperienced pilots, but part of it was the aircraft itself. A bad landing could cause the fuselage to crumple under the stress of the wing's weight, crushing and crewmen trapped inside. Escape was another nightmare. The cramped interior, crowded with the radio operator, engineer, and 2 pilots in the cockpit, made emergency evacuation chaotic. To bail out, crewmen often had to squeeze through narrow bomb bay catwalks while the aircraft was burning or spinning out of control. Every second lost meant death. By comparison, the B-17 offered slightly easier escape routes, and this perception alone made many crews feel safer in the fortress. Yet for all its flaws, the Liberator kept flying. Not because crews loved it, but because America could build them in staggering numbers. Losses, no matter how terrible, were replaced almost instantly. The result was a cruel paradox. The same qualities that made the B-24 so effective as a weapon also made it one of the most dangerous aircraft to its own crews. Every time men climbed aboard a Liberator, they faced a sobering reality. The enemy might shoot them down, the weather might bring them down, or the Liberator itself, with its quirks and flaws, might betray them. The B-24 destroyed more enemy targets than any other Allied bomber. But for those inside, survival was never guaranteed. If the B-24 had one unbeatable advantage, it wasn't grace in the sky or durability under fire. Its true power came from sheer numbers. The Liberator became the poster child for American industrial might, an aircraft churned out by the thousands, built faster and in greater quantities than any bomber in history. The centerpiece of this production miracle was Willow Run, a massive factory complex built by the Ford Motor Company in Michigan. The plant was so vast it stretched a full mile from end to end. Inside, the assembly line resembled something out of science fiction for its time. Parts moved from station to station, workers specializing in small tasks, and a completed B-24 rolling off the line every 63 minutes at the factory's peak. By itself, Willow Run produced nearly 9,000 Liberators, half of all the B-24s ever built. And Willow Run was only one of 5 facilities producing the bomber. Consolidated, Douglas, and North American plants added to the flood, ensuring that from 1940 to 1945, nearly 19,000 B-24s would be delivered into combat. This number dwarfed the B-17, making the Liberator not just the most produced heavy bomber, but the most produced military aircraft of the entire war. For America's high command, the math was brutal but simple. If a mission cost 20 bombers, more would arrive tomorrow. Losses could be replaced with industrial muscle. Crews knew this too. They weren't irreplaceable. The machines weren't either. The strategy wasn't to preserve, but to overwhelm. On paper, the system worked. Thousands of Liberators filled the skies over Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. They burned German cities, strangled U-boats, and supplied distant fronts. But behind every aircraft on the line was a grim reality. Each plane would carry a crew of 10, and statistically, many of those men would never return. Willow Run's efficiency kept the bomb bays full and the formations steady, but it also ensured the conveyor belt of sacrifice never slowed. The Liberator was the very embodiment of total war. Victory not through elegance or survivability, but through relentless production and the willingness to accept horrifying losses. The B-24 achieved milestones that should have made it legendary, but history has a cruel way of choosing its heroes. The public remembers the B-17 Flying Fortress as the symbol of America's bombing campaign, while the Liberator, deadlier and more numerous, became a shadow in the background. Much of this came down to perception, propaganda, and one tragic twist of fate. Take, for example, the famous Memphis Belle. Immortalized in films, it was celebrated as the first American bomber to complete 25 combat missions over Europe and return home. But in truth, that honor belonged not to a B-17, but to a B-24. An aircraft named Hot Stuff had already achieved the milestone 3 months earlier, in February 1943. Its crew had braved 25 missions of flak, fighters, and firestorms and survived. Yet their story ended in tragedy. On their victory flight back to the United States, Hot Stuff crashed in Iceland, killing 14 of the 15 men on board. With no heroes to parade before the cameras, the U.S. War Department shifted the spotlight to the Memphis Belle. Its crew became the poster boys for bomber success. while the Liberator that had truly made history was forgotten, buried under wreckage in the frozen North Atlantic. This wasn't an isolated case. The Liberator was often overlooked despite being the backbone of Allied bombing. Its ungainly appearance, boxy fuselage, high-mounted wing, twin tails, lacked the sleek romanticism of the fortress. To the press and the public, it looked less like a symbol of strength and more like an awkward workhorse. But the statistics don't lie. The B-24 destroyed more shipping than any other aircraft in World War II. It closed the mid-Atlantic gap, carried heavier bomb loads than the B-17, and played roles ranging from bomber to submarine hunter to long-range transport. It was, in every sense, the backbone of Allied air power. And yet, the stories that could have immortalized it, like hot stuff, ended in silence. What should have been a legend became an afterthought. The irony is haunting. The Liberator won battles and reshaped the air war, but the glory went elsewhere. By the end of World War II, nearly 19,000 B-24 Liberators had been built, more than any bomber in history. It flew further, carried more bombs, and struck more targets than its rivals, yet its crews gave it grim nicknames like the Flying Coffin. The Davis wing made it efficient but unstable. The cramped fuselage made escape nearly impossible. Training accidents were frequent, and ditching at sea was often fatal. For every enemy it destroyed, the Liberator claimed countless of its own. When the war ended, B-29s replaced it, and most B-24s were scrapped, their metal recycled within months. Only a handful survive today, silent reminders of the men who flew them. Though overshadowed by the B-17, the Liberator closed the Atlantic gap, crippled enemy supply lines, and became the backbone of Allied air power. Its legacy is one of sacrifice, a bomber that won wars not by glory, but by sheer, brutal numbers. Subscribe for more World War II stories, because the darkest ones are still ahead.